Okay, thanks everyone for giving me the attention. And it's kind of difficult sometimes to follow when you're listening to other people's presentations to sort of kind of keep a line of trajectory in the sense of actually what you want to sort of share. But I think there's a lot of synergies in some of the things, so I will do my best to sort of speak about certain issues that are very important to myself and to my brother, which we work under the name Minimaforms, and I think in parallel my life as an educator, primarily at the school called the Architectural Association in Bedford Square, where I've been directing something called the Design Research Lab. A lot of the things that I want to speak about is really around the subject of behavior. It's something that I feel kind of enables a kind of conversation that sort of breaks the kind of sometimes caricature between how we relate to the world, how we relate to machines, how we relate to each other. And I think this is fundamentally premised with a certain idea that the world as we perceive it is our own invention, as someone named Heinz von Forester once said. And he used to run a research lab at IIT, which was the Biological Computation Lab. And I think a lot of the words that Philip actually used in his introduction about experimentation and research, I mean, it resonates very much with me. And sometimes I think when you go through things like a PhD in this kind of post-traumatic academic sense, you start to try to understand actually what are the kinds of trajectories of where you're thinking and others, who are your friends, who are your enemies, what kind of periods of time actually somehow are motivated, I think, with things that kind of resonate. This was the cover of a magazine called Bao, and what it basically says is all is architecture. It was a kind of provocation, let's call it in the early 70s, to architects. I'm trained traditionally as an architect, though a lot of people don't think I'm an architect. My brother's trained as an artist. Nobody thinks he's an artist either. We sit somewhere in between. We've never really believed in disciplinary distinctions. But I think at the heart of it, at some point, when you start to read some of the provocations of the 60s and 70s, it sort of resonated with a certain kind of optimism and a certain desire to kind of see beyond the kind of specializations of things into something much bigger. Hollein would say a true architecture of our time has to redefine itself and expand its means. And many areas outside of this notion of building will enter into the realm of architecture as well as architecture. And architects have to enter into new fields. All are architects, everything is architecture. And when I speak about architecture, the definition that we speak about architecture is as a kind of environment. It's about space, it's about time. It's about sort of constructing this attitude as interface. And it has, I think, a history of kind of research, kind of led experiments. If you look at people like Buckminster Fuller here at Black Mountain College or Robert Rauschenberg working with some of the students, I think a lot of the things that have really shaped, I think a lot of the time that I've spent in England, which is getting close to 20 years now, pretty much half my life, has very much about been trying to see some world within all of these worlds. And I think a lot of the things from the 60s and 70s resonate. This is McLuhan, who basically said, if you're interested to look to the future, look to the present, because generally society lives in its past. If you look at kind of experiments that were somehow, in a certain way, naively kind of put together as a response to technology or to challenge the orthodoxies, in this case of an architect, this is Nicholas Negroponte, who set up something called the Architecture Machine Lab, and for 10 years was a kind of space for constructing research in some way to look at how CAD systems would influence the role of the architect and redefine it. 10 years fast forward later, this mutates into something called the Media Lab at MIT, and you can understand how that has also participated in a kind of revolution in terms of communication. The AA, that, because I imagine many people may not know what it is was also a kind of space, a space that I think produced a certain provocation in terms of what one can consider space, and not only in terms of nurturing ideas and discourse, but also about challenging and provoking fundamentally kind of orthodoxies of how we see, shape, and kind of construct our sort of frameworks and how we sort of create these spaces for other people. This is Boyarsky, who was a famous uh, leader, let's call it, of that school. The school also had a certain kind of ethos, which, in parallel to Minimaforms and in parallel to my own work with Stephen, this title, I think, somehow summarizes our basic pursuits in design and art and architecture as a kind of continuous experiment. This was a title that James Gowan gave to a book which was a coalition of essays that were supposed to speak about the AA and about learning and about teaching and the whole concept of knowledge. But it's also a thematic that runs in probably one of the more influential books that I actually read was Robert Morris, the artist's collected writings on sculpture, which was called A Continuous Project Altered Daily. My past has a past like many other people, and it had in a certain way as my brother was working in kind of more new media and film and let's call it sound art kind of environments. I was working for architects like a man named Peter Eisenman, who, when I moved back to New York, gave me an opportunity to work on something called the City of Culture, which I got a chance to participate on the first two buildings, which are on the top side of the building, of the image. And the challenges of actually seeing what it took to sort of work through kind of durations and changes, both social and political, and actually the demands of technologies and the realization of scale and all of these other things. And I've had a history of working in a lot of formalist architecture, like Peter Eisenman's office or Zaha Hadid's when I first came to London. And there were a lot of questions that me and my brother had, very much based on the issue of beyond form, beyond subjects of the finite and the fixed, regardless of how dynamic or spatial they actually were. And so we set up this as a kind of space for ourselves to experiment, which we called Minimaforms. The concept of Minimaforms takes this kind of thought of the minima as being the moment when form comes into being. This process of becoming was really much kind of conceptualized as this idea that nothing is actually fixed or finite. Everything is dynamic and evolving. And we understand that in the concepts of science and catastrophe theories and all of these other things. But our relationship to that world, and it goes back to the observer situation, was really about that moment in time that we can recognize something. So for us anyway, if it's an interface, if it's a building, if it's a robot, it doesn't really actually matter. It's really about trying to look at behavior and enabling, trying to also have a position, if I'm honest, about technology as not something sitting outside of us, but it is us. Technology is a very human thing. And I think in some ways, I think we forget that and we somehow overly simplify actually what our relationships and our kind of complex interactions actually really are. I'm also situated at Somerset House, which has been the first home that we've had as Minimaforms, if I'm really honest, in over 15 years of practicing in London. The kind of work, I think if this would actually play, would be cool, but if not, it's okay. Okay, I will continue and let's say some other videos hopefully will play as we continue this. The other side of my life in parallel has been something called the DRL, and that has basically been a space where we have pretty much students coming from everywhere, coming to study and work in self-organized ways. And in some form, this is an experiment that's been going on almost 20 years. The thing in terms of method and practice is that these things are actually developed in a strategy where people are working together. We may speak about authorship, but realistically speaking, the problems that sometimes we're entertaining under the guise of research, or in this case, what we call design research, are things that are much more than what one person can actually engage in, or 1 year, or even one studio. It's really about sort of opening up a certain kind of shared and collective platform and a framework that allows people to experiment and to disseminate those kind of findings, because in some way we're trying to sort of upgrade the conversation and in a sense the practice and the thinking about how we sort of respond to times. And the program itself, when it was 10 years old, we had a 10th anniversary and we basically treated it as a kind of design build see what our students were doing in those 10 years that were outside of us, and then use it as an opportunity to build one of these things together, which was a competition that we held. And this is, in a very conventional sense, a way of thinking about architecture. We make stuff, we put it together, and we create space. The research that we kind of explore with the students, and a lot of the students in my studio, are also about expanding those definitions. Architecture doesn't have to be something continuing the tradition of being something fixed and finite. It can be dynamic and evolving. We work in prototypical ways. We try to build the stuff. Learning through making is fundamental. And it doesn't matter if it's baking Zeppelins and this kind of continuing lineage of Buckminster Fuller and Cloud 10 and 9, or if it's sort of moving into the world of robots. Subjects of robotics. But it's not really about robotics. It's much more about giving agency to things. Like how we could sort of think about a way of constructing space. Sorry, I got like 3 screens here. Without necessarily having a blueprint or a master plan. But if things themselves had the ability to interact with other things, and they had the capacity to sort of create space, how could we prototype these things almost like intelligent creatures that have the capacity to use computation not as something that's trying to optimize space, but that's trying to sort of understand itself, understand its own capacities within the environment, and construct and co-construct environments that we could actually share with it. A lot of this stuff has been happening over the last 10 years. And the studio has really sort of looked at these kind of unitary models, which in some way work through high populations. And they take their clues from a lot of social insects and collective strategies in nature. We're not interested in biomimicry. We're not interested in how things look like. We are interested in how things behave. We are interested fundamentally in how things communicate with each other. We look to different models of those source systems that are geometrically based to try to see how we could sort of operate in this kind of hybrid world between digital and reality. So for example, thinking about a space that's based on taxonomies, constructing creatures. So here, for example, we're designing individual creatures which are based almost like a spring, a pneumatic spring that can kind of roll and curl by itself. And you could start to see the world as these individual things, but we're not interested in more just being more. We're interested, for example, when 3 of them converge together, that a new behavior could be spawned. That behavior, for example, being a tripod, and a walking strategy being something that's emergent, instead of something that on an individual basis could only actually do something like simplistic. We work with a lot of computation, we work with a lot of physical prototyping, we're not sponsored by anybody, so we have to make things the way that we can in the studio. We share a lot of those thoughts about making in that sense. You see something like a curb here is going to become an obstacle for the curling dude, and the one that actually has a tripod configuration is something that somehow could negotiate that space. When we start to think about what the role of these things actually could be, we also have to also understand that somehow language is not necessarily a friend in this. Let's put it this way, sometimes I get some commentary from people very close to me that I don't fundamentally really believe in language. And Kossuth, in some sense, plays a kind of argument for that. For example, here we're looking at 3 chairs. Every one of them fulfills the definition of what a chair is. The image of a chair is still a chair. The object of the chair is a chair. The definition of a chair is a chair. And in some sense, as a conceptual problem, it sort of sets up a certain kind of problematic. But our world is actually probably more conceptual and maybe demands more complexity, because it assumes that a chair somehow is a fixed definition. If we look at the fact that things themselves these days have their own agency, a chair has to also understand what a chair is, but it sees it from a very different perspective. A perspective here is Raffaello Di Andrea's robotic chair, which self-assembles and sort of reconstructs itself by understanding that it's constituted in this case of 4 legs, a back, and a seat. This is a different distinction about what chair could potentially be. With that, it's not necessarily relegated just to the subject of chair as object and chair as a finite definition, because realistically speaking, as soon as we introduce time and as soon as we introduce culture and as soon as we introduce all of the different things that young designers and artists and architects and pretty much everybody is sort of working on today, we also introduce different strategies of agency and who has agency and do we give agency. And agency for me is something that's very important. I think the work that Raffaello Di Andrea is doing at ETH is also very important. It's been, I think, my bedfellow in thinking about some of these implications in architecture, but not about building things with them. It's not like Ramazio Kohler, like moving bricks and packing them or stacking them. Here I really find this video really fascinating because you see these drones doing this dexterity juggling with each other, and you see them actually juggling with a human as well. It's not like they need us. They can be doing this kind of dance. It's not about substituting us. It's about fundamentally kind of constructing a different kind of idea of what this kind of human and non-human agency could potentially offer us. This is a world that if we don't speculate on and be proactive in actually starting to think through some of these challenges, then we are going to be very passive observers of a world that's going to come like a tsunami and wash over you. These are the things that are being developed not by people like Raphael Di Andrea. And this kind of stuff is viral. It goes on Facebook and everything else. This is Boston Dynamics. This is a very old robot. But this is a robot that basically is being built and rebuilt. And you see these things as autonomous machines into the world that can navigate different terrains, that realistically speaking could be killing machines. A lot of this was DARPA funded, but then it was bought by Google, then it was sold by Google, so then you guys can sort of pick up the lineage of where that stands. I think as designers, we have the potential to sort of offer different ways of thinking about stuff. So a lot of these self-assembled strategies here, we sort of took that to the problem of the autonomous car, but looking at it from the perspective of ownership and thinking about a distributed network of what it meant if you actually had, almost like the Barclays bike sharing system, you had a strategy where you think about these things as distributed networks. You use the monowheel, which is basically the mobility model for these kind of things, but you also think about these things being able to sort of create space. 90% of all of the automobiles are idle or parked. And if we are talking about things, let's say even in the center of London, we always talk about it as a model that has to be dealing with congestion charges and other stuff to sort of mitigate these things. But fundamentally, we can start to think about that. That's not something new. And there are a lot of industries that are trying to automate things, but it's not necessarily just automation that is regulated in a controlled way. These are things that are going to co-evolve with us in our environments, in our habitats, and with how urbanization and densification is accelerating, this only starts to sort of problematize it further. The idea of robots, things like CNN Money will speak about robots and designer babies. We'll talk about genetically modifying our food or also changing the way that things should appear. If the natural world somehow seems so foreign and alien that we have to make things in a somehow perfect way. And you start to realize that, you know, in the 60s and 70s, there was a whole kind of rallying point, primarily through a kind of social belief in a greater good in some sense, potentially. This book is an important one for us, which is Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of the Motorcycle Maintenance. And he says, living at the front of the train is a point where the past and the present collide with the future, and that's really a rough place to be, turbulent and unsteady. I think these words are kind of really important. I also think some of these seminal characters like Cedric Price are also very important. He said technology is the answer, and he followed, but what was the question? How we start to really, I think, discuss these things really matter. And that goes beyond, I think, the individual's kind of desire of why they create the things themselves. A lot of the stuff that I speak about when it comes to the work that I do with my brother or with my students. We may be looking for mobility models, but we discover through making some other things. This lifelike kind of qualities that dynamic things actually have, this emotive, empathetic kind of characteristics that we have with systems that we know fundamentally are not alive. They force us to sort of reconsider what that really means, and I think in a profound way, if we allow that to be something that we could actually really speak about. To work on these things doesn't mean that you're somehow trying to play God or reconstruct the world anew. We start with very simple ways of how a couple of things can interact with other things. We start then by starting to think about, well, how would we start to develop and design this? How can we make a system that has the ability to have these kind of behavioral attributes? And we use very fundamental things like light and movement, sometimes sound, very straightforward strategies, which when we started doing a lot of this stuff with my brother in Minimaforms, a lot of this stuff wasn't really that easy to do. There, there wasn't really Arduino and all of this other stuff. We were basically hacking music things and other stuff and just trying to get something to work. And I think making things work is super important. And then having the opportunity to do that also allows you to have a certain kind of serious play where you can start to look at these kind of elements which you think are self-assembled robots, but then this idea of lighting is not just how they communicate with each other, but it's also how we are in dialogue with this stuff. And when you realize that mobility and transport and all of the fundamental kind of ecological drivers and all of these kind of profoundly difficult things that people don't really know how to engage in are kind of food for you to somehow sort of dive into. And I think in a very unapologetic way and forcefully sort of speak that art, architecture, and design actually has a meaningful contribution to it. It's not substituting it. It's not even playing a kind of social critique. It's about dynamically sort of engaging in this stuff. You realize that we are empowered today to sort of develop proof of concepts that enables people to understand what we're talking about. And this goes back to this, I don't want to be misquoted with this idea that I don't believe in language, but I think language has a certain limitation. And developing prototypes and allowing these things to be in the world also allows other people to see things in that world. And I think just like a piece of good literature may do that, I think doing this through design and through prototypes and through other ways of thinking about things kind of opens up a kind of boundless territory. So we can develop with my students in the DRL strategies of self-organization, and we can speak about things that potentially are for extreme environments. We can develop the technologies, we can develop proof of concepts, and we could start to speculate about challenges. It's not like we need a huge company to somehow give us the money, to give us the equipment to do stuff. I think maybe it's my New Jersey background, do it yourself, whatever, but it seems somehow if you're waiting for people to somehow believe in you without sort of constructing the framework for them to really understand, then you're really either at the mercy of what people are sort of contributing to you and their ideas of what you should do with that, or you sort of take it upon yourself to really sort of prototype what you think these futures are and to be able to use the technologies today to be able to look at stuff. We developed this strategy for what a space station could potentially be. The brief was an extreme environment, but realistically speaking, we were trying to do something that wasn't modeled, completely force-driven. Spherical particles because it's the most packed strategy that one can deploy in space. We were reading a lot of literature of all of the space debris and all of the micron elements that are projectiles that are tearing apart our satellite systems. So we said, could we use that material? And a lot of these kind of physical prototypes, coupled with a lot of the digital tools that we were using, were allowing us to sort of construct, I think, a very, I don't know if you want to call it science fiction, but from my perspective, science fiction is fact. And for us, we went to California, we met with the Jet Propulsion Lab, we reached out to space architects, we tried to really kind of engage these things, and the conversations were quite high level. Mostly because in some way, being able to sort of work through all of these things, and this is an animation of just basically all of the space dust, that is quantifiable data that you could potentially use if you like. these information sets are out there, and they could be starting to sort of work in this world, which is somewhere in between simulation and digital and analog fields, part speculation, but also part based on very, uh, let's call it sound science. In my own work with Stephen, I think a lot of the early things were very much mirrored. The way that I sort of work between the DRL and Minimaforms is really a collective thing where some of my colleagues are here, some of my students come to help us out. A lot of the experiments that we do, this is a project called Face Breeder, which was one of our earliest projects, which was basically on an invitation by a man named David Green from Archigram. We gave a lecture in the University of Westminster. He didn't know us. I was 24 years old. I just came back. He said, we have a show which is called The Future Vision of London. It was something Architecture Foundation was putting forward for a future vision of what this place was supposed to be. At the time, you had Norman Foster doing his pitch for the Olympics. You had Zaha, who did a quite formal intervention. We basically thought London was a social hybridizing machine. David basically gave us £500 and access to P3 at the time, which was a storage facility where all these old computers were. And we decided to make a portrait machine. At the time, anyway, very early on when I came back to London from New York, this whole idea of representation and the limitations of communicating through that just didn't really hold water when we were trying to sort of think about how systems were sort of working. So maybe the last 15 years of my work has been to sort of think about design intuition, but to see it through a kind of systemic process. So these wire diagrams were not necessarily illustrations. They were in some way the conceptualization of how we wanted to sort of make things intuitive. We didn't want to give instructions to people, just like a photo booth. You stick your chin on it, there's a bendy sensor, it takes a picture and it throws it in a database. You start to use installations as ways of seeing things. We started to see, like it was originally in Selfridges, and it was at the AA, that people had a certain response to their own identity. If you want to see this work, it's online at facebreeder.com, but we did this whole process of breaking things apart, trying to gain access to it in a much more tangible way, and very naively, probably almost electrocuted ourselves many, many times over. But you start to see how these technologies can be reappropriated just to give us a window into ourselves. So in this sense, a 3x3 grid of images, you can still recognize yourself in one of those quadrants, and the anticipation people had when they were looking at these things, waiting for themselves as the database was being populated, and it was just a sort of random sorting, you started to see something that was, I think, from my perspective and my brother's, something that was very powerful, which was the role that installation and space made. What happens when you sort of enable curiosity? The experiments that we were doing at the same time in the DRL was about sort of pulling the virtual world into something that was wearable. This is 2004, developing kind of headpieces that I'm sure if we had someone sort of saying, you know, video display on your face, moving through wearables. I'm sure there was an industry there that opened up recently. But we were sort of basically trying to do these things. We did them in Trafalgar Square, tried to do them as operable ways. There were kind of cultural prosthetics, blurring in a kind of augmented reality of some of the cameras. We were using the LCD screen of a recording camera and using other cameras to get sensory information and connecting them also to rooms. So this was something that we called an emotive room at the time, and we're working on a project in 2019 called an emotive room, using old security system, like basically like if you ever watched Tom Hanks in Big dancing on a big keyboard. We basically took our keyboard and opened it up and literally put it on the floor. And so those touch pads were basically ways to control a lot of the reactive graphics and things like that. These diagrams were somehow evolving in that spirit. And the idea of coming together and working on these things without being trained in them has its limitations, but it also comes to it from a very different perspective, where design actually finds a way to negotiate, I think, terrains which are not about technological hurdles, but it's more about how one can sort of construct maybe different ways of seeing the problem. when I started my PhD, a lot of the stuff about AI and robotics and all of this stuff, second order cybernetics, my PhD supervisor was a man who unfortunately passed away, but his name was Dr. Ranulph Glanville. He was a student of someone named Gordon Pask. He was supervised by people like Hans van Forester and others that I mentioned in the quote earlier. At MIT, where I spent some time with Krzysztof Wodicko, I got really ingrained in kind of history of the Media Lab and history of people like Rodney Brooks and Marvin Minsky and these kind of characters, aside from Negroponte. Brooks in 97 basically said it's going to be harder to distinguish what's alive and what's machine. The boundary may become meaningless. When we start to look at this kind of concept of taxonomy, I think you start to really unfold a strategy of thinking about things, thinking about spatially how they come together and seeing how their behaviors are changed through a repercussion of that. We've done experiments in soft robotics. We've used viscous fluids and really tried to see how these things actually kind of explore different forms of organization. And I think a lot of the strategies that we try to look at, something like a simple voxel or a 3x3 grid that we could make as a soft robot, could be able to sort of reconstruct almost like a new Lego set and rethink and reconsider actually how we could create space. So if you imagine that without a finite body plan, these things can come together and they could start to behave. They can mirror the same movement behavior and just basically create maybe more efficient mobility strategies, or then they could start to be almost like Play-Doh, dynamically actuated and being able to curve, being able to grip, being able to sort of evolve from a very bottom-up world, different kinds of logics of thinking and creating in space. To do that digitally is one thing. To do that physically also demands different control systems and so forth. So we tried to build this silicone robot itself, basically using those digital behaviors in an animate and analog way, and using the same logics of controlling those voxels, expansion and contraction, being able to see how this thing could rotate and move and all of this. A lot of this stuff is about making things shared. I mean, we've shared some of the spaces like Eva has at the Barbican with a piece that we did called Petting Zoo, which was the first video. And I think as much as it is about sort of creating this kind of synthetic creatures or AI robots, we were interested in behavior and we were very interested in kind of emotive responses to these things. And culturally speaking, how these things are synthesized in the world are pretty interesting. This was part of an exhibition called Digital Revolution. And I'll speak to it briefly. Some of the things are more robotic, some of the things are pure atmosphere. And this is a project that we did called Memory Clouds. It was originally done in 2006. In 2008, we did it in Trafalgar Square. And in 2010, we did it at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Space, which was basically hybridizing the oldest form of communication with SMS technology. For my brother, who's probably more of the poet in this group, enabling is a very important word for us. Enabling is basically shedding away this kind of habitual and allowing people to be curious and construct different sort of relationships with novelty. A man like Gordon Pask would say that once someone basically finds a novel situation, they try to continue to find more novelty. That novelty, in a sense, is curiosity, and with curiosity comes the ability to control it. In that sense, control is basically to utilize it. The projects that we work on is a land art piece in Norway. We've done this Memory Cloud project in Detroit, but we're working on some other things there. And we've been working on Greece's national park in Athens, in Faliro. We do proposals like competitions and buildings. And the buildings themselves are sometimes quasi-landscapes, structures. They use light as a kind of ongoing thing. They also challenge in terms of the way that we make things. So this is textile formed casting strategies where we make these and use more of a kind of traditional sculptural strategy to test these prototypes. But they're basically soft cast strategies that we're using, basically textiles, with the idea that you could take the architecture with you in a remote place and sort of cast it or use compacted earth and stuff like that with. So I've shown this already. This is Petting Zoo. This is a vehicle that we did with Krzysztof Wodicko. This is what we're working on right now, which is an emotive room for a gallery in New York. This is the textiles that I was speaking about. And just strategies of basically how we can deal with scaling up some of this stuff. I don't know how I'm doing with time. I think I have 10 minutes left. And if I'm boring people, you guys excuse me, I'll be fast. Yeah. But I think maybe just to somehow speak a little bit about some of the current work, and I'll just show maybe 5 or 10 minutes of the research that we did at the DRL, since one of my students is here and I could present her work for her. This is a project that we're currently working on at Somerset House. We've been working in 2 years with my brother and with my colleagues on constructing something called Oven in the World. It's sort of taking that Heinz von Forester quote and looking at it from a very different perspective, which is utilizing glass and just using these glass orbs, which are like 1,500 spherical particles into the space, constructing basically a lattice that we're sort of working on. And this lattice is basically a space which is completely based on actually your vision system. It's no image, it's all about your image forming eye. The space is very dynamic. It's also something that is very much based on optics. And I think the reason that I show this, and I can't show too much more of it in some sense, is that the logics behind a lot of the things that we have are not really foregrounding technology for the sake of technology. Technology, like I said, is a very human thing. And if we speak about projects like Memory Cloud and stuff like that, it fundamentally is trying to hybridize those things very directly. And I think the importance because of that is to sort of think that we're somehow sitting at a really interesting moment in time where it's a kind of crossroads between actually what we think design should be and all of the models around us are kind of challenging that. And I could speak to that very fundamentally. When my brother first started doing the research for this project, Memory Cloud, he was at Central St. Martin's in 2003, and we were doing these kind of atmosphere experiments because a lot of the things that we were doing when we were trying to sort of support ourselves in London was working in kind of experimental music and festivals. My brother was really interested in this idea of constructing an atmosphere and really interested in sort of hybridizing this strategy of looking at something like smoke signals, which is the oldest form of visual communication. It's a process that is 5,000 years old. And to sort of construct a space which was just animated through basically the words of others. I'm showing this project because in some way it's an installation that has somehow, we put it aside because we got a lot of fanfare. It was also called at the time in 2008, possibly the most blasphemous art installation ever done in London, because for 3 nights we basically created an open canvas for people to say whatever they want at the base of Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square. And you could understand some of the implications at the time, particularly things like thinking about riots and thinking about how things would be policed and what it means to bring people and crowds together. We did it again in Detroit. In this sense, to be honest with you, the conversation was just this: can we animate the built environment through conversation? This wasn't like animation using animate software. When we did it with the ICA, there was a woman named Emma Quinn who was head of the new media department there, and she asked us which space was the most viable for this, and we spoke about Trafalgar Square always being a space for communication. If it's for celebration or for protest, this was public. The public space as being something that could be revitalized. We did it over the 3 nights here, basically using the city of the canvas. But in London, somehow, you get basically different kinds of conversations because these things are very much part of the everyday. In some sense, it's not totally awkward to kind of stumble onto an installation or to use a city. Like now we have art events and art nights and these kind of things. In Detroit, leading up to this whole thing, aside from us being artists coming in to do a piece, this whole idea of expression and saying something became something that sort of caught the imagination of the people there. They were teaching haiku workshops for children, all of the art institutions kind of came together for those 3 nights. They had a bus shuttle service that tried to connect down this kind of 8-mile corridor. And a lot of the things were somehow building up for something, because in some way, using the Detroit Institute of Arts, which is in the center and the heart of the downtown, as a space to basically express and to communicate, sort of constructed, I think, a framework for people basically to express themselves in a very different way. The testimonies that people submitted were really testimonies about how they saw their city, the challenges that they had with that, and to share that in some way. And Detroit Institute of Arts, this very civic building, that front entrance is locked every day. There are a lot of different challenges that people have. And I think that that's an important thing to sometimes recognize. And what we call public space, in some sense, in a city that is basically shrinking and the center basically having no kind of urban fabric to kind of stitch these things together, also poses more challenges. Why I think it's an important project for us, and I still think it's probably the most important project we've done, is that we did it again for 3 nights. It was 2.5 hours each night. You could read all of the testimonies. It's on something called voiceofdetroit.com. Because of the nature of how it brought some people together, even as something that was totally ephemeral, what came about it was basically the city coming together and creating a light festival, using the city as a canvas. They saw it as an opportunity. They call it the electricity, and it's been basically going on since 2014. Inviting artists, expanding the remit through the whole city, using art and interventions to basically use the city as a canvas, but also to have certain conversations that one potentially couldn't have in any other way. Bringing people together to have conversations that are not feeds on social media, but are actually really people, some parachuting in as artists, others obviously citizens of the city. And I think when you start to see an event that maybe had like 200 or 300 people on the night, because the Detroit Institute of Arts is not open on Saturday and Sunday, to things that you see it sort of evolving into something else, and to see how all of these things are starting to speak about how different sort of interventions, as minimal as a projector or any of these things could be, to reclaim the city and to give a certain kind of agency and identity to people, I think through the kind of creative practices. I think it still remains for us, I think, quite an important piece, and it's still something that we continuously talk about. Even if it's one of our earliest projects, I still feel it's motivated at the heart with a way of thinking about things that sort of enables other people to see their situation in a different way. I think with that, maybe I'll close, because I'm sure there's questions and conversations that people want to have. And if you're interested in the work, you can have a look at Minimaforms and DRL. Okay, thanks.